Hi there. When we bring data into Power BI, it's sometimes a pivot table in Excel to begin with. And so what we see in our Power Query, just as I have here in Sales by Region, is a data source that actually is a pivot table. What you may not realize is that you could actually unpivot it in Power Query. So I'm going to go to my Sales by Region query, as you can see here. I'm looking at my Transform tab in the ribbon, and I want to unpivot a certain column. Now I want to unpivot the year, so I'm going to click on 2020, hold the Shift key, and click on 2022. And here's my Unpivot Columns button. If I hit the drop down, I can unpivot the columns I've got chosen, unpivot other columns, the ones I haven't got chosen, or unpivot only the selected columns. I think I'm just quite happy with unpivot columns. Now when I do that, I go from having a pivot table, which is columns and rows and an intersecting aggregate value, to having a tabular list. And to make this clear, I'll click on the attribute, press F2 and call this year. I'll click on the value, press F2 and call that sales. So I've effectively unpivoted a pivot table within Power Query. But what if you want to do the opposite? What if you've got a tabular list like we've got here and you want to pivot it? Well, you don't have to do that in Excel. You can pivot data within Power Query. So I'm going to start by choosing year because that's what I want as my column in the pivot table. I'm going to go to the Transform tab and choose the Pivot Column button. And it says, well, what do you want to use for your values? Well, my values is my sales. So sales is going to become the aggregate values. Year is going to become the column, which makes region a row. And so I OK that. And I've effectively created a pivot table. So you can pivot and you can unpivot within Power Query. Let me just delete that step so I go back to just having a tabular list. Besides pivot and unpivot, we often need to also merge data. And I want to have a look at merging columns together, for example. I'd like to merge region and year into a single column, but I don't want to do that in sales by region. I want to keep sales by region as a query with these steps applied, but now I want to create a new query based on that query to create some further steps that go in a different direction. So I'm going to go right click on sales by region and I can create a query that references this query. You can also do this on the home tab. If you go to manage, you can reference as well. So if I go to reference, it makes a new query that references the sales by region. So whatever happens to sales by region in terms of its steps will affect this query that's based on it. I want to rename this query, so I'm going to click it and press F2 and call it sales by year and region. I think I used an ampersand in my notes. Let me just correct myself. Sales by year and region. Now, I would like to select region and year, so I hold the Control key or the Shift key to select year. So whichever feels more natural, select both of those columns. Now, as far as merging them, I want to replace those two columns with a merged column. So I'm going to go to Transform. When I go to Transform, there's a button called Merge Columns. And if I then look at this, it says, well, what do you want as a separator or a delimiter between the region and between the year? And I simply want a space. So I choose space from the list of options. You've got colon, common, you've got these different characters, or you can even choose custom if you want to create something above and beyond this list. So I'm going to go space, and I want to call this column region and year. So because I chose the Transform tab in the ribbon, these two columns will be transformed into a new column called region and year, which joins them or merges them together and puts a space between them, Auckland 2020, Auckland 2021. So that's how your merge columns works. What about if I show you not only merge columns, but how you can actually transpose and how you can actually reverse and how you can actually count rows, these sorts of options here. Let's start with transpose. What transpose does is it takes the tabular 2 columns and rotates it 45 degrees. So instead of 2 columns, you'll end up with 2 rows. And instead of 33 rows, you'll end up with 33 columns. 33 columns and 2 rows. So let's go transform. And there you see it. It's literally taken those 33 rows, flip them on their side, and turn them into 2 rows with 33 columns. What I could then do is ask it to promote this first row into column headings. So I'd go home and I'd use the first row as headers, and that lifts up that first row and turns them into column headings. So transpose, you may not use it, but it's a thing. You can transpose. Often I have data that's more like this way and I want to flick it the other way. So that's when I'll transpose. Let me just have a look at that. I don't know if it'll work so well, but if I go transpose, there, it's flipped it back the other way. Maybe if I delete that step, delete that step, delete that step, and transpose. Transpose, it puts it back into being 2 columns. Yeah, and then delete that step. So that's the transpose option. And maybe even delete it again. Oh no, I'll keep that there. Let's instead make another query that references sales by region. Click on sales by region, right click sales by region, choose reference, and create a new query that references sales by region. Click on it, press F2 to edit it, and we're going to call this one regional sales. Now, if you wanted to reverse the rows so that Whakatane ended up at the top and Auckland ended up at the bottom, then you would simply use on the Transform tab the Reverse Rows button. And so Whakatane ends up at the top and Auckland ends up at the bottom. And I can easily delete that step as well. So that's what the Reverse Rows does. We've looked at use the first row as headers, we've looked at transpose, we've looked at reverse rows. And if you wanted to count the number of rows and just be left with a single fact, a single digit, then I would just say count rows. And it just comes back and says 33 rows. So that is the number of sales. So I could rename the query number of sales records. F2, number of sales records. Yeah. Oops. So those are some of the buttons that you get, and I can convert it back to a table just using this button here, but I'll just go home. All right, so those are some of the buttons on the Transform tab: Transpose, Reverse, Count, Use, and we've merged and we've unpivoted and pivoted. Come back for the next video and I'll show you some other things you can do to transform data.